So this is our continuing discussion of Simondon's Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information, Volume 2. We're reading the text, The History of the Notion of the Individual, which we started last week. So we've seen the pre-Socratics, and Simondon generally is taking the sort of interpretive lens on the pre-Socratics, is this opposition between the order of simultaneity and the order of succession or duration, and so this is a fairly traditional interpretation of the pre-Socratics, like the opposition between Parmenides and Heraclitus in particular, as the order of being and the order of becoming, is a traditional one. But he's talked about the Ionian physiologists as having a sort of primordial unity of being and becoming, that sort of precedes the split between the two that we find in later pre-Socratics. And then we talked about how Heraclitus has this sort of so his doctrine is not just a doctrine of becoming, but it's a doctrine of the unity of opposites, including the unity of being and becoming. And Simondon talks about these radical Heracliteans that Plato makes reference to, like Cratylus, who held that it was that language should be used in such a way that you never assert anything has permanence, or you never speak in such a way that you are sort of presupposing the permanence of any entity, because everything is constantly changing and flowing, and so we have to speak in a way that reflects that. Simondon points out that this sort of displaces the contradiction from the unity of opposites that we find in Heraclitus himself to contradiction between the spoken language and the reality in which there's this constant flux. So what ends up happening is that we sort of become we sort of lose the possibility of expressing anything determinate. Everything we say seems to presuppose some fixed entity or some fixed concept, and so it becomes hard to understand how we can even say anything at all if we have to avoid asserting anything fixed or permanent. And so what Simondon, his philosophical project as a whole, or one of the major motivations for it, is to develop an understanding of the unity of being and becoming that is not subject to this type of impossibility of speaking. So it's going to be a unity of being and becoming that we can actually express in linguistic terms, that we can speak and understand rationally. So that's the sort of motivation for Simondon's philosophical project. And we also saw the brief look at the atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, and they have this. The doctrine of atomism is one of the sort of targets that Simondon sets up in the introduction that we read in Volume 1 to Individuation itself. And so he takes it that in the atomistic doctrine, the only real individuals are the atoms. Each atom is an unchangeable entity that is perfectly individuated. It's distinct from every other atom. And then composite beings that are made up of many atoms joined together, they have only a sort of relative individuality. So they are individuated to some extent, but they're constantly changing in terms of which atoms make them up. So you can think of the food you eat gets incorporated into your body, and so your body incorporates other atoms that belonged to other bodies, and then um, so the individuality of a composite body is only a sort of relative individuality compared to the absolute individuality of the atom. And then and I should also mention uh, Anaxagoras, who we saw a little bit before that, who talked about um, this sort of uh, homogeneous substance out of which everything is extracted. So for Anaxagoras, everything contains a portion of everything else. So bone contains blood, and blood contains bone, and we just don't notice all of these different things that are contained in everything because of the small quantities. And then there's a sort of second principle, which he calls Noose, or intelligence, or mind, however you want to translate that, um, which is responsible for extracting different substances out of this sort of primordial mixture of substances. And so here is the sort of the first time that we have a sort of dualism, which Simondon assimilates to hylomorphism, the doctrine of form and matter that's associated with Aristotle. And so for Simondon, this doctrine is sort of the Anaxagoras' doctrine of Noose is sort of the starting point of the hylomorphic theory, which is the other main target that he criticizes in the introduction of Individuation. Right. So that's more or less what we saw last week, and then this week we'll start on the section on Socrates and Plato. It's fairly long, so I don't think we'll finish it today. But as I mentioned, I think when we were sort of getting started on reading the this text, the history of the notion of the individual, what's particular about this text, or this interpretation, is that Simondon sets up an actual opposition between Socrates and Plato in a way that is not that common in the secondary literature, I think. So he doesn't take Socrates just to be a sort of mouthpiece of Plato's opinions. He's going to distinguish between Plato's position and Socrates. So we'll see that as we go along. Okay, so I'll read a page or so, and then we'll go around as usual. Socrates and Plato. The notion of individuality takes on several aspects in Plato, but after the first dialogues, a veritable evolution takes shape that brings the problem onto a physical, metaphysical, and political terrain. Whereas in the first dialogues, the interest of this problem was mainly ethical. At the same time, what is primordial is no longer the temporal dimension of the individual, but its dimension of simultaneity, that which allows it to actually insert its structure into the structure of the city and participate in the latter. The example of the exceptional individuality of Socrates, who was barely integrated into the city, but who has a direct participation in immutable values like justice, is primordial from the start. The individual is this singular, irreplaceable, amazing being that paralyzes with his presence, like an electric eel with its stinger. This being has a destiny more so than a place. He wants to escape from the earth, and if he accepts remaining on earth, this is by comparing himself to the beasts among other domestic beasts in the pen that the gods have constructed for humans. The individual the individual lives as he must when he sticks to his destiny, i.e., when he is not in contradiction with himself. By remaining at Athens when he could have gone elsewhere, Socrates accepted in an implicit contract to obey the laws and to respect them. The unity of the individual, his coherence with himself, is essentially founded on the steadiness of this life throughout successive moments. Socrates is not just faithful to the implicit contract that binds him to the city, he is also the one who knows how to evoke again through myth certain things that seem forgotten or out of season. His order and his continuity are deployed according to the temporal dimension. For the present, he lives so little according to current events that he is nowhere and everywhere, from nowhere and from everywhere. Atopos is the deeply ambivalent qualifier that his enemies applied to him and that Plato could also attribute to him in his first dialogues. This atopos presents all the paradoxical characteristics that reveal veritable individuality in its rapport either to societies, to institutions, or to intellectual modes. In the name of the old Athenian spirit, Aristophanes attacks him as a sophist. Plato shows in him the adversary of the sophists, attacked by those who reproach him for not being able to defend himself when he is accused before the tribunals. This being of contradictions is coherent only according to a temporal order, not according to a system of different successive actualities. Knowledge itself is something that is not an integral part of the system of actuality. Knowledge is buried within the deepest recesses of the individual being and the purest part of himself. Only contradiction, in the sensible form of pain or the logic of the dialectic, can prevent the individual being from remaining in the pure system of actuality and force him to seek reminiscence in it, like the forgetful slave questioned by his master. Socrates only sends back to the sophists the young men who do not have within themselves a veritable richness of interiority and cannot give birth to any truth, even if they are entrusted to this midwife of minds. Let's stop here. This is one of these giant paragraphs that we've come across a few times. Right, so he's starting out with this sort of portrait of Socrates as this exceptional individual, and this was sort of the understanding of Socrates that contemporary Athenians had, that he was a sort of strange person, that he wasn't involved in politics in the way that most citizens of Athens were, and he sort of went around and asked people questions like what is justice or what is piety, and sort of kept pestering people to define these terms, and eventually was put to death, basically for just annoying people all the time. He's sort of one of the early, I guess, personalities that we can identify in history, that he's depicted as sort of a distinct personality in a way that a lot of other historical figures are not. So we know things about like his temperament and his behavior in different circumstances and all kinds of things that we don't necessarily know about a lot of other historical figures. And so Socrates, so this term atopos, so meaning not belonging to a place. So even though he's an Athenian citizen, he doesn't sort of fully belong to Athens in the way that Pericles or some other political figure would belong to Athens. And it's this sort of out of placeness that that makes Socrates into this individual figure in a way that other people belonging to the same intellectual circumstances are not individual figures in the same way. And so we'll see as we continue reading here that this sort of individuation of Socrates has to do with the way that he sort of extracts himself from the realm of the everyday opinions through the art of dialectic. So by continually asking questions and sort of bringing to light contradictions that other people were sort of not aware of, or sort of allowed to subsist without sort of trying to deal with them. So he's going to ask people what justice means, and then ask them further questions once they give a sort of attempt at a definition, and then those people will end up contradicting themselves. And at least, so Socrates famously says that he only knows one thing, and that's that he knows nothing. And so he takes it that at least knowing that certain definitions of justice or piety or whatever are not good definitions. So being able to refute these understandings of justice or knowledge or whatever the term is, this at least gives him an advantage over the people who think that they know what justice is. And so this is sort of the quasi-skeptical attitude of Socrates in some of the Platonic dialogues, where he's sort of just he doesn't really advance a doctrine of his own, but he questions other people's assertions and sort of forces them to contradict themselves and admit that they actually don't know what they're talking about. And so this Simondon takes this to be a particularly or he takes this to be characteristic of Socrates as opposed to the Platonic doctrines that come in other dialogues that we'll see as we continue reading.
Seems like the idea of Socrates' placelessness is meant to contrast with the structural conception of the individual for Plato later on, in which the individual seems to be sort of defined by its place. But I think we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, we'll come to that a little bit later when we get to Plato's doctrine of the ideal city. But yes, so for Plato, there's this understanding of the individual as being inserted, or the way Simondon presents it here is that in Plato's Republic, which he takes to be a later dialogue, in the Republic, there's this sort of a caste system that's presented as sort of a necessary component of the ideal city, so that each person has a particular role to play in the city, which is divided into these different groups of people that have different roles. And then each individual is assigned to the place that corresponds to their natural aptitudes. And so I think that's right, that Socrates is the type of person who would certainly be very difficult to assign to a place in Plato's ideal city. And yeah, so there's a certain irony in the fact that Plato takes Socrates to be sort of the key intellectual figure of Athens of his time, and at the same time, his doctrine of the city, which he sort of puts into Socrates' mouth, is one in which Socrates would have a hard time finding a position. But yeah, so we can talk about that more when we get to the section on Plato's doctrine of the city. Okay, so let's go on to the next page or so if someone else would like to read.
Sure, I can go.
Oh, go ahead.
The art of Socrates is to draw the individual being out of the system of actuality that absorbs him by way of an interrogation that embarrasses him. Like his mother, Phanerete, who knew with song how to excite or calm the pain of women giving birth in order to hasten or delay labor, Socrates knows with speech how to stretch or relax the effort of his interlocutor towards the truth, which is not yet elucidated. This necessary contradiction of the individual by himself, this opposition to oneself, for the veritable dialectic does not require a contradiction between the propositions of interlocutors, but between each of the interlocutors and himself, decants and reveals the individual extracted from all the dregs. Plato said later that the great king himself, if he were not contradicted, would remain impure to the bottom of his heart. Opposition to oneself is a purification and a rediscovery of oneself beneath the easiness of present appearances. Sensations and the habits of everyday life hide the individual from himself, isolate him from himself with a screen of illusions. The physics of Anaxagoras uproots man from the effort in which he can turn toward himself. The act of opposing oneself is the most primitive form of action upon oneself, and it turns the individual into a being who not only is and thinks objects, but who knows that he is and who thinks himself. The positive form of this return to oneself, which is expressed in the formula inscribed on the pediment of the Temple of Delphi, know thyself, requires as its condition of validity the preliminary existence of the power to deny oneself, to be opposed to oneself, to doubt oneself. Socrates attributed to his Daimon certain warnings which were always negative and took the form of inhibition or refusal, and which intervened every time he risked allowing himself to be carried away by a momentary impulse, or to succumb to the entreaties of his friends by ceasing to be himself, like at the moment of his death, when the boat that should have delivered him from his fate had just landed near his prison. An order according to time that detaches from the order according to the instant intervenes in this splitting into self and daimon that makes possible action upon oneself and then self-knowledge. Moral individuality is not part of the system of actuality. This first splitting results in a second, that of the soul and the body, which no longer have the same destiny. The body is the sign and tomb of the soul, soma sema. Plato did not add features of which Spintharus makes us aware to the portrait that the contemporaries of Socrates have left us in conformity with this evocation. The extraordinary power of Socrates, the force of his wrath, and his singular ugliness. Socrates was an exceptional being for his contemporaries. When he was for himself, he was for others, attached to the Athenians by the will of the gods to stimulate them like a gadfly would stimulate a horse.
Okay. So here he's continuing this sort of portrait of Socrates, and he's making reference to a number of statements that Socrates makes in some of the Platonic dialogues. So I forget which dialogue this is, but Socrates compares himself to to a midwife, because his mother was a midwife, and so in the same way that the midwife sort of regulates the labor, likewise Socrates regulates the sort of giving birth to a new idea or to a new thought. He sort of by asking questions and sort of interjecting in the way that he does, he sort of pushes the interlocutor towards a new discovery, and so this role of contradiction. So it's not so much a logical contradiction in the sense of two opposed propositions or a proposition and its negation. It's more a sort of contradiction of one person by another in a conversation, and then what that brings about is a contradiction of one of the interlocutors with themselves. So they begin by saying justice is X, and then Socrates keeps asking questions, and then they end up saying, okay, well, now I see that justice can't be X because whatever, and then they contradict their initial statement, their initial understanding of whatever the topic is, and so this work of contradiction is a sort of self-knowledge. So we start in this position of having of being ignorant of ourselves, of our own understanding of key concepts, and then it's only through this dialogue or dialectic that we come to realize that we don't fully understand these concepts, and that we are ignorant of how these concepts work, and so learning about our own ignorance is a form of learning about ourselves, and coming to know ourselves. And then Simondon talks about here this what Socrates calls the daimon. So it's this voice or sort of interjection that Socrates says that he hears whenever he is about to do something that doesn't sort of fit with his mode of life, I guess we can say, or his spirit or something like that. So he claims that he hears a voice that tells him not to do something, and it's always a prohibition or a negative statement. It never tells him you should do X, but it tells him don't do Y. And so, for instance, in I believe this is in the Phaedo, possibly I may be wrong, but the other interlocutors talk about how they had planned to allow Socrates to escape after he was condemned to death. So they had a plan to break him out of jail and get him out of the city. And Socrates refused to go along with this plan because he argues that he has to obey the laws of Athens, and so if the Athenians have voted to have him put to death, then he has to follow that decree. So this daimon is a sort of principle of moral individuality. So it prevents Socrates from doing something that is contrary to his moral nature. Um, and so this so Simondon takes it that this split between the Socrates himself and his daimon is sort of the cause of a second form of splitting within the individual that is Socrates, which is the split between body and soul. And Socrates, in several different dialogues, he talks about the importance of the soul as opposed to the body, and the body as being a sort of um, uh, a tomb of the soul, is the term that he uses. So it's the soul is sort of imprisoned in the body, and death is a kind of liberation of the soul from the body. And there are dialogues. I forget. I think this is also no. This is in the Phaedrus, if I remember correctly. Um, he talks about the life of the soul after death and how certain souls are reincarnated in animal bodies and other souls are reincarnated as human beings and so on. Um, uh, and so there's a whole doctrine or a whole myth of how the soul lives after death, and so there's a within the individual Socrates, there's a split between the body, which is perishable and subject to change and decay, and then the soul, which is immortal, and which lives on after death and doesn't change in the same way. Um, so this is sort of uh, a more complex notion of individuality than what we've seen in the pre-Socratics. It's a very articulated notion of individuality. The individual is something that has structure to it, as opposed to something like an atom, which is completely structureless.
I remember him talking about the daimon in Volume 1. I think that there we talked about how it was the refraction of the trans individual in Periclean Athens, like the historic specificity, I guess, of that time. And also, I think he associated it with inhibition, which also kind of seems to be the way that it functions here.
Yeah, I don't remember the details of that development. I know he did mention Socrates Daimon in Volume 1, but I don't remember the details of that development. But yeah, it's especially this role of inhibition that is important for the daimon as sort of the guardian of Socrates' moral individuality. It's because he has this daimon that speaks to him and tells him not to do things that he can sort of preserve his individuality. That Whereas other people who don't have this daimon, or who ignore their daimon, are less individuated than Socrates is, or are less consistent as individuals than Socrates is. And so, yeah, this role of inhibition is to preserve the individuality of this exceptional individual that Socrates is.
One thing I don't totally understand about this kind of like dynamic notion of the individual for Socrates is that it seems like, on the one hand, individuation is this self-relation that is achieved by dialectic or the contradiction with actuality, I think is what he calls it. But it seems to be like the discovery of an individuality that is already there. So I don't know, maybe it's more like an individualization than an individuation. And I think at some point he relates this to the notion of personality, which I think in volume 1, what he described as the relation between the empirical and transcendental subject. And I don't know if he's saying that the subject of which somebody, one comes to have knowledge after encountering Socrates is this, I don't know, something like a more primordial individuality that's already there in the way that the transcendental subject could be said to be. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think I see where you're going with that. Yeah, so there's definitely a sense in which the individuation is already there. So um, in the dialectic through which we come to know ourselves, we come to learn about ourselves as we already are. So uh, there's a certain existence of the self before this operation of self-knowledge happens, and so we'll see this as we continue reading. But Socrates um, uh, starts to develop this idea of reminiscence as being the knowledge that the soul has before birth, and so like the um, sort of clearest articulation of this doctrine is in the Meno, where Socrates gets a slave who doesn't know geometry um, to sort of rediscover how to double the size of a square, um, just through asking questions, and then the slave sort of finds the solution just through Socrates' prompting, and not through being told how to do it. Um, and So Socrates takes this to be an indication that this geometrical knowledge was already present in the slave's soul before his birth, um, and uh, and so likewise the knowledge that we gain from dialectic is in our soul before our birth. It's only it's sort of hidden knowledge. It's knowledge that we don't have available to us. And then Socrates' art of the dialectic is what allows us to come to re uh, relearn what we already know, and this is reminiscence in the specific sense that Socrates uses this term. Um, so yeah, so the self that comes to learn about itself is already there as an individual. And we can maybe say that this operation of self-knowledge or coming to know oneself is a sort of deepening of the self, or uh, the self becomes something more individuated, or uh, more structured, as opposed to something kind of obscure and unstructured before this operation of self-knowledge happens. But it's an operation in something that already had this individuation before birth, and only um, has to relearn what it already learned or what it already knew.
Maybe that's one of the reasons he says that Socrates' position on individuation only works for moral or ethical individuation. He's not really trying to explain the initial individuation of what is rediscovered through the dialectic.
Yeah, so Simondon is going to make a pretty sharp distinction between the Socratic dialogues. So in Plato's dialogues, the ones in which we have sort of a faithful representation of Socrates as someone who is interested in moral or ethical questions about justice and courage and piety and similar ideas. And then, as opposed to the Platonic dialogues, the ones that are sort of Plato putting forth his doctrine in Socrates' mouth. In those dialogues, we have more metaphysics and epistemology, and like in the Timaeus, we have a whole doctrine of the creation of the universe, and each of these these later dialogues, or the ones that Simondon takes to be later, the ones in which we have Platonic doctrine, a lot of the times, several of them involve Socrates only as a sort of passive participant. So he just says, yes, that's true, or things like that, where the other person, like in the Parmenides, it's the Eleatic stranger who does most of the talking, and then Socrates just says, "Yes, that's true," or "Yes, I agree," and so on. And then in the Timaeus, it's Timaeus who develops his account of the creation of the world, and Socrates is again sort of a passive participant. So in each of these dialogues, there's a different understanding, or a different account of where the individual fits in with the rest of the world, as opposed to an attempt to account for the ethical individuation of a person, which is what Simondon takes the more Socratic dialogues to be dealing with. Okay, so let's go on to the next page or so from the top of 446, Negation and Contradiction.
I can read. Negation and contradiction allow for each person to know themselves, at least those who are something. Charmides, a reserved adolescent, does not know what reservation is. Laches and Nicias are two brave heroes who are unaware of what courage is. The pious Euthyphro does not manage to say what piety is. In his interrogations, Socrates turns these beings who are ignorant into beings who are self-aware. However, just as every fault stems from ignorance, and no one is wicked voluntarily, this change in self-knowledge for the individual is a veritable transformation of the individual being, not to become other, but to affirm oneself in oneself. Knowledge has the value of being, for it modifies action. The complete individual is the being who knows himself, and to that extent is consequently the cause of himself. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the self-knowledge that the pious, the reserved, and the brave acquires is a knowledge that does not reach individual particularity qua absolute originality, but instead the fundamental force of personality, which valorizes the individual and makes it such that he is known as a man who excels by such a virtue. In some way, self-consciousness guarantees the dominance of a basic virtue around which the whole personality is constructed. Socratic knowledge reaches the personality rather than individuality. This is why it founds the coherence of the successive. The vision of the individuality of the human being is not sufficient for Plato, who, quite preoccupied with political problems, wants to assign a place to the individual being in the city, as well as to each being in the universe. At the same time, the dialectical method changes direction. In the first dialogues, dialectics is essentially an interrogation of the interlocutor by Socrates. Socrates does not bring forth any doctrine, he merely forces the individual being to know himself. Conversely, later on, it is no longer the individual who is the depository of truth. Dialectics. Sorry, Jan, could you mute your mic? Dialectics becomes a dialogue between two opinions, two theses that face off. There is no inherence of truth to the individual being. Finally, in the last dialogues, the relation of truth to an individual existence further degrades. Socrates or the Eleatic stranger are merely Plato's spokesman, and their discourse becomes a didactic monologue at the limit. The life of the individual, the destiny of his soul, are less and less the object of a very rigorous search. Myth alone is the means for expressing that which is of the order of becoming. The evocation of destiny is therefore integrated into a cosmology that turns the world into a great living being. The world becomes the scene in which the souls of men and the gods evolve. What is sought here is no superiority. Individuals are grasped as the manner of a general eschatology that links astronomical speculations to the myth of the soul. The Timaeus reveals the birth of the world soul and the formation of its body. which it has organized itself. So it seems like in this presentation of the history of the individual as moving back and forth between privileging structure versus dynamism or being and becoming, at least in this part of the discussion of Plato, he's closer to maybe like Parmenides, or a thinker of being with a limited becoming. Although I think he's going to complicate that later on.
Yeah, so it's not just that. So there's this sort of back and forth between being and becoming, as you said, but there's also a sort of I guess taking one or the other of being or becoming to be fundamental, and then the other to be sort of derived from it. So in Plato, we especially see this doctrine in which becoming is always secondary to being, and so what truly is are the unchanging ideas of entities, or the unchanging ideas of justice and knowledge and so on, and these are what truly exists, and then the entities that undergo change are sort of mixtures of being and non-being. They sort of partly exist and partly don't exist, um, and so in this understanding, the uh, dialectic is not so much a sort of development of an individual. It's a kind of recovery of something that exists prior to the individuals that we are familiar with, these mixtures of being and non-being. Um, and so the doctrine of the ideas sort of subordinates the individual to something that is not exactly individuated in the way that a human being is. That these ideas are uh, um, sort of the principles from which change happens, or towards which change happens, but they themselves don't undergo change. And so the human individual that undergoes change is not a real being, or not a fully existent being. And we'll see this as we continue reading in the next couple pages. But this is also connected with the point that Simondon makes here about how Plato is preoccupied with political problems, and so Plato takes it that the ideal city, the city that has the best possible laws and constitution, is a city that wouldn't change. So because if a city is changing, that means it's not occupying the best possible structure or the best possible formation. And if a city has the best possible formation, then change would only be a decline from the best possible structure. So in the same way that the best possible city is one that doesn't change, likewise, we the individual is only subject to change insofar as it is not a complete being, or not something that is fully existent. And then this is also tied with the development of the dialectic into a sort of exposition of a doctrine that we see in some of those other dialogues, the ones that Simondon takes to be more Platonic than Socratic. So in these dialogues, we just have one person delivering an exposition of a doctrine, and then the other party just says things like, "Yes, that's true," or "I agree," or just makes like little interjections like this that are not really that don't really make up a dialogue in the way that some of the earlier or the ones that Simondon takes to be earlier, do. And I should probably mention that there is so this division of the dialogues into the earlier and the later ones is a sort of traditional one. So it doesn't come from Simondon in particular, but more recent scholarship, I think, is less inclined to accept this traditional division that is primarily based on what we or what later readers would consider sort of the sophistication of the different texts. So the ones that seem more sort of philosophically sophisticated, like the Parmenides or the Sophist or some of these ones, are treated as being later ones, and then some of the ones that seem simpler or less sophisticated, like the Euthyphro or the Apology, are taken to be earlier texts. But this sort of relies on our understanding of what is philosophical sophistication, which isn't necessarily what Plato's understanding of philosophical sophistication was. What we take to be the later dialogues aren't necessarily later. It's something that that's sort of based on our assumptions about philosophical sophistication and may not be accurate. Okay, let's go on to the next page. I can read. The individual, and the philosopher in particular, must establish his place in the city. And in the depiction of the philosopher, Plato reveals what could be called the paradox of individuality, which remained hidden in Socrates because Socrates didn't seek to define a place for the philosopher in the city. According to the Phaedo, the philosopher is the man who, purified of the taints of the body, no longer lives except by way of the soul separated from the body. In the Theaetetus, he is still the man who, inept and clumsy in his rapports with men, will never have a place within human society and will remain without influence. According to the Republic and the laws, he is on the contrary the guardian of the constitution of the magistrate, who imposes on the village's inhabitants the belief in the gods of the city or the perpetual prison. This is the ever-present conflict in the individual being between the necessity of escaping from earth to purify himself in the contemplation of the ideas, whose sister is the soul, like a contemplative thinker who has retreated from the world to gain self-knowledge, and the other necessity, which is the construction of the just city structured according to the exact and rigorous rapports that are the object of contemplative science. True individuality is perhaps in that which forms the link between these two orders, according to which the individual affirms himself in himself, within solitary self-knowledge, and expresses himself via the creation of an object of work, a work as real as things, in the society of other men. In addition to these two traits of pure interiority and pure exteriority, there is also in Plato an aspect of individual existence, which is like a mixture of the two. The enthusiasm and inspiration of the Phaedo and the Symposium, the individual is that which can only be generated or created in the beautiful. Within the individual being, there is a force that is the daughter of Poros and Penia, which is both a positive and a negative thing, satisfaction and lack. Love is one of the forces that joins in them isolation and presence to others, self-affirmation, and the search for another reality. Beauty therefore corresponds to these two aspects of the individual being. Every individual existence supposes self-affirmation and a search for something else. Affirmation and searching are correlative and complementary. The erotic dialectic, which leads from beautiful bodies to beautiful souls, then from beautiful souls to the ideas in which they participate, accounts for this apparent paradox of the nature of the individual. Nevertheless, this conception is possible only due to the relation of participation, and this relation of participation itself leads to supposing the independence of ideas and the objects that participate in these ideas. Here is where Plato diverges from the Socratic conception of individual reality. For Socrates, the search for self-knowledge led to a discovery of the unique characteristic due to which a thing is what it is, and which could be called the nature of a being. This is why Socrates seeks to reach in Euthyphro what makes Euthyphro pious. For Socrates, this characteristic is something that resides in the individual being. This search was possible for Socrates because it was limited to virtues or vices, i.e. to moral things, which can be grasped in human individuals. On the contrary, Plato wants to apply the method of seeking ideas to all beings, to mathematical beings in particular. The properties of mathematical beings are visibly independent from the sensible characteristics according to which a certain triangle or a certain circle exists, because it has been traced in a certain spot at a certain moment and in a certain way. Straightness and circularity are not contained in this object like piety in Euthyphro or wisdom in Socrates. These mathematical realities exist outside the objects that reveal them to the senses. Similarly, in physical things, a quality like whiteness will exist more so in a small amount of pure white than in a large amount of grayish white. This is because the sensible object contains neither straightness nor circularity, nor whiteness, but merely participates in his realities that Plato calls ideas. This separation, which Aristotle severely reproached Plato for in his Metaphysics, prevents Plato from directly accepting the Socratic conception of individuality. Since the ideas themselves are discovered as hypotheses, it is necessary to rise back up to the unconditioned term in which they participate. The science, therefore, requires anterior to life a vision of ideas, which implies the pre-existence of the soul. However, just as certain individuals like Pericles or Aristides, without possessing science, since they have been unable to turn their sons into politicians, nevertheless possess the capacity to govern the city well, the existence of right opinion must be supposed in them. This right opinion is not a characteristic that belongs to individual reality, like piety or wisdom in Socrates' theory. It is not that by which a being is what it is. That is, that form itself that makes all pious actions pious, but the force that makes a man do what he does. It then must be acknowledged that right opinion derives from the inspiration of the gods. Philosophical inspiration is itself an aspect of the madness of love, for it is spiritual generation in the soul of the disciple. The life of the mind in the individual being is just like that of the body. The love of beautiful bodies extends the life of one individual into another. The love of beautiful souls extends the powers of the intelligence from the teacher to the disciple. The individual being therefore learns to go beyond himself. This beyond is not the same as the one Socrates indicated when he invited the soul to escape from the earth. I'll stop there because, that was more than a page. So here we have this development of, or that we've transitioned from talking about Socrates in particular to talking about Plato. So here we have this notion of contemplation, contemplation of the ideas. So whereas in the Socratic dialectic, we have this development of moral ideas and this attempt to sort of purify these moral ideas like justice. Instead, in these more Platonic dialogues, we have this attempt to find the idea of knowledge, or the idea of the city, or in general, we have attempts to define to define metaphysical concepts, and to develop this doctrine of ideas as being the primary realities. And so this doctrine has to do with, in particular, with mathematical realities. And so there's the famous line that Plato required all of his students to study geometry, and there was that it was supposedly written over the door of the academy that let no one enter here who was ignorant of geometry. And so Plato takes mathematical knowledge to be the sort of paradigm case of knowledge of the idea, or knowledge of what is extra sensory, so something that is beyond the sensible world. So the mathematician draws a circle or a triangle in the sand, or today on a blackboard. But what the mathematician is reasoning about is not the actual circle drawn in the sand, but the ideal circle, the circle as such. And it's this capacity to this capacity to have knowledge of something that is not sensible that Plato takes to be especially characteristic of mathematical knowledge, and and that he sees as being as consisting in this contemplation of the ideas. So we have knowledge of what is not sensible by contemplating the ideas, and this is what true knowledge consists in. And we'll see more on this as we continue, but this doctrine of ideas as separate from the entities in which they inhere, or the entities that participate in them. This doctrine of separation is the one that Aristotle criticizes most explicitly in Plato. There's the famous what's called the third man argument that we'll see discussed a little bit later, where Aristotle argues that the doctrine of a form of man, or an idea of man as being what all men participate in, is incoherent, and so we'll see that a bit later. But that's the what this bit about separation means here. Okay, let's continue from top of 449. If someone else would like to read.
Yeah, I can go again. Plato's individual is surpassed by a program into universality and not by a metabasis eis allo, migration toward elsewhere. From the love of a body to the love of every beautiful thing, from the love of beautiful objects to the love of beautiful souls, from the love of beautiful souls to the love of beautiful ideas, then to the love of the immense sea of the beautiful, from which all these beauties originate, there is a progress toward universality. The poet instructs future generations through inspiration. It is also through inspiration that the Pythia performs that fine work of hers for all of Greece, whereas in her right mind she performs few or none. Amorous inspiration, the starting point for philosophy, gives wings back to the soul. Without this inspiration, the soul attains nothing but a cunning skill. Have you ever noticed this about people who are said to be vicious but clever? How keen the vision of their little souls is, so that the sharper it sees, the more evil it accomplishes. Conversely, the individual soul, thanks to inspiration, sees operating in it a conversion of becoming to being, which takes place with the entire soul. The isolated being in its individuality is the fallen soul of the Phaedrus. This is the prisoner who, in the cave of the Republic, expects the dialectic to come and give him a moment of conversion toward the light. The individual is thus capable of passing the individual is thus capable of passing through two states, that of isolation, which is consecutive with the fall of the soul from the sky down to earth, and that of rising back towards the world of ideas, of the return to the vision of which the soul is a part. The temporal circularity of the succession of these two aspects establishes a coherence of their opposition. However, this first conception of the individual conforms to the validity of true opinion, and recognizing within the individual a mediating reality between being and nothingness, and therefore a being in becoming, is incompatible with the critique of participation in the Parmenides and the critique of science in the Theaetetus. The political exigency is an exigency of unity, as much for this unity that the human individual is as for this other organized individual that is the ideal city constituted by classes or castes, which are like social individualities with their own structure. The unity of the individual will be obtained and maintained by the unicity of its social function. In the just city, it is necessary to regulate the activity of citizens in such a way that, quote, each of the other citizens is to be directed to what he is naturally suited for, so that, doing the one work that is his own, he will become not many, but one, and the whole city will itself be naturally one, not many. The citizen is then singularly defined in his relation to the other occupations. Plato is consequently far from the myth of the primordial hermaphrodite, which shows veritable individuality in the couple and not in man or woman. In the ideal city, the individual is indeed the particular being. Individuality is given from the start by the rigorous determinism of the character chosen by the soul before incarnation. Individuality is no longer an optative, that of the incomplete soul, forgetful of itself and the ideas, throughout the avatars of incarnation and successive lives, or in the search for its half, from which it has been separated by divine wrath, according to the old Hesiodic myth.
Right. So here we have this is the bit that I mentioned earlier on when we were talking about the political doctrine of the Republic. In this doctrine, we have individuals as assigned to particular functions within the city, and so he divides up the city into the guardians, who are the sort of philosopher kings, the ones who make decisions for the city, and then the warriors, and then the I forget the name for the last class, but it's the class that is sort of occupied with the business of the city, um, and so every individual has a natural aptitude for one of these functions, and then the guardians will sort of test each individual as they're growing up, and then decide which category they belong to, um, and um, so the argument here, in the way that Simondon presents it, is that each individual should occupy one function so that they can be a unified individual, as opposed to having to occupy multiple functions. Means that they are sort of disunified or disparate, rather than being united. And then a city that is composed of these united individuals that have a singular function would itself be a unified city for that reason. Um, and then there's also mention here of the critique of participation in the Parmenides. So the Parmenides is a strange dialogue, because, well, for a few reasons, but one among them is that Socrates plays a sort of passive role in this dialogue, as I mentioned earlier. He just sort of answering, or sort of just responding to the doctrine that the Eleatic stranger, who is the main personality in this dialogue, the Eleatic stranger develops his doctrine, but what he sets forth is a series of different paradoxes, where each hypothesis that he presents, he ends up showing leads to contradiction, and so um, um, uh, there it's a very abstract dialogue about like being and the one, and if the one is not, then being is not as well, or things along those lines. Um, but here Simondon is taking it to be a sort of internal critique by Plato of his own doctrine of participation of entities in the ideas, and he takes this to be incompatible with the idea that we saw a little bit earlier of true opinion. And so true opinion would be a sort of quasi knowledge. It's not knowledge in the proper sense of the term, but it's because the people that possess true opinion are not capable of teaching others how to engage in a particular practice, like the practice of politics. But it's a kind of intuitive sense of how to behave in a particular domain. So you can think of like maybe like our the way how we know how to ride a bike. Like if you had to explain to someone what you do to ride a bike, it would be kind of difficult. Like it's hard to teach someone how to ride a bike, but we know how to do it in this sort of intuitive way. So our understanding of how to ride a bike is a kind of true opinion, as opposed to knowledge in the sense that Plato wants to use that term. And so this true opinion this doctrine of true opinion has to sort of grant that there's an intermediate between being and non-being. There's a sort of intermediate state in which the individual doesn't have a true knowledge of being, a knowledge of the ideas, but at the same time, it's not a sort of pure nothingness. The individual has this sort of quasi knowledge or this implicit knowledge of how to do something, and so there's this intermediate state between being and non-being, and this doctrine that Simondon takes to be in contradiction with the dialogue or the exposition in the Parmenides. And then maybe another bit that might be unclear or obscure if you haven't read the Symposium, but there's the bit here right at the top of 450, the myth of the primordial hermaphrodite. So in the Symposium, Aristophanes appears as one of the characters, and he delivers this this myth of how love sort of came about. And so in this myth, the gods create human beings as these sort of conjoined couples. So they're entities that have four arms and four arms and four legs that are sort of united with each other. And then at some point, the gods split each of these double entities into two, and then love is the attempt at reuniting this sort of conjoined original hermaphrodite, and so that's what that bit is about. So in this doctrine, the true individual is this primordial hermaphrodite, or this sort of double being, and then each of us, as the single being, is a sort of half individual. We're sort of the remainder of this act of splitting, and so this is Simondon takes this myth to be opposed to Plato's own position, in which the individual is individuated by its place in the ideal city. Okay, let's continue with the next page. I think we're at the so near the top of 450. The individual becomes the elementary unity.
I can read. The individual becomes the elementary unity by means of which the order of the city is constructed. It is no longer what contains right opinion in this amorous madness that brings the individual to surpass himself and to extend beyond himself through his body and his thought. To be an element of the ideal city, the individual, on the contrary, must remain in his place, in the narrow limits going all the way to the fixity of the level of wealth. Women will occupy the same places and fulfill the same functions as men. By a sort of reversal of the second conception of individuality, Plato returns to a vision of individual reality that is no longer dynamic and expansive, like that of the Symposium and the Phaedrus, but structural, like the one that Socrates seemed to search for. Just as Socrates sought in Euthyphro what makes Euthyphro what he is, i.e., a pious man, Plato searches for what makes an artisan, or a warrior. In this conception, there is a return to immanence. What makes a warrior is not his participation in the archetype of the warrior or his aspiration toward the ideal warrior, the fact that he has within himself, within his individual reality, a certain character that consists in a definite rapport of powers of the soul and functions of the body. This character is like a sign engraved in the individual being. This character is the structure of the individual being and determines it in its actions. Here, there is no longer even the aspect of transcendence that appeared in the conception of Socrates, by this idea that, thanks to self-awareness, which requires detachment with respect to the order of actual things, the being accomplishes within himself what he is essentially due to his fundamental virtue, i.e., that in which he excels. In the city, detachment is unnecessary for the individual to be himself. The structure that constitutes his individuality is not, in fact, a structure independent from the order of the city, i.e., the actual order. The structure of the individual is in a rapport of analogy with the structure of the city, and the social order is constituted by the rigorous insertion of these individual orders into a vaster order. The individual is a finite reality, and the city is also a finite reality. Individual and city are like microcosm and macrocosm, and the rapport of analogy that exists between them is an identity of rapports internal to each. The order of succession is incorporated into the order of simultaneity, for the order of succession has no creative value. Philosopher magistrates must look after the maintenance of the laws and the structure of the city. Recently, we have called the Platonic city a city without friction, i.e., a system in which the play between the different elements is null, insofar as it does not allow any indetermination to remain between the relative displacements of the different elements, albeit without any force of friction despite this rigorous mutual adaptation. In the city where the different functions play without friction, like the organs of a theoretical machine, no free force of true opinion or enthusiasm is left to individuals. The citizens are who they are, depending on their place. And the temporal dimension, for the city as well as for the citizen, is reduced to the most perfect approximation of permanence possible. The only natural and spontaneous evolution, in fact, is decadence. Consequently, the social relations the individual involves with other individuals indicate the internal relations that constitute what we would call today the psychology of the individual. There is a reversibility between the social order and the psychological. There are as many functions in the city as there are faculties in the individual soul. Concupiscence corresponds to the function of the artisan, insofar as it is lodged in the stomach and the genitals. The passion of wrath corresponds to the function of the warriors. Reflective intelligence corresponds to the function of the guardian. The seat of the passion of anger is the heart and more generally the thorax. On the contrary, the seat of reflective intelligence is the head. Yeah, so this seems to be basically totally the opposite of the Socratic notion of the individual, I guess, except for this idea of the discovery of the real care of the individual in order to fit them into the structure. It seems like for Socrates that discovery it entails, at least initially, a separation from the existing structure, as opposed to fitting into it. Also, Plato's ideal city kind of sounds like Starship Troopers.
Yeah, I think there's probably influence in the other direction on Starship Troopers from Plato. But yeah, so there's this doctrine of the individual as occupying a particular function in connection with the proportion of the functions within the body. So each of the positions within the social order has a particular body part associated with it. So the guardians are associated with the head, the warriors are associated with the heart, and the artisans are associated with the stomach. And so each in the people that belong to each of these categories, this part of the body predominates over the others, and so there's a sort of microcosm macrocosm relationship between the city as a whole and the individual, so that each individual is a sort of uh, representative of the city, but with the predominance of one particular function over the others. And yeah, so this is quite different than the position that we see in some of the ones that the dialogues that Simondon takes to be more Socratic, in which we have this notion of the individual as being something separate from a social order and having to sort of extract itself from the social order. Here we have the individuation is defined through the individuals being integrated into a social order, and there's no longer this this idea of the soul as being sort of outside of the body as something independent of the body. Now we have the soul as being the souls of these different classes of people are characterized by their relationship to the body. So different types of souls correspond to different types of bodies, and so yeah, this is a very different representation of what the individuation of the individual consists in than we see in some of the other dialogues that we talked about earlier. And we also see here this this notion that I mentioned earlier that the the individual, like the city, is something that can only ever sort of decay from perfection. Um, there's no sense in which there's a sort of growth into perfection or a development or a sort of dynamics of the individual. The city is an ideal city insofar as insofar as it is a city that doesn't change, and vice versa. So the individual, likewise, insofar as it undergoes change, is an individual that is not a perfect individual. I think we can compare this to what Simondon says about the brick in Volume 1, where he talks about how the brick is individuated once and for all, and then it only ever decays afterwards. It eventually turns into dust. Whereas in the living individual, the process of individuation is ongoing, and so the living individual is a sort of slowed down brick or a slowed down crystallization. It's a sort of neotenization of physical individuation. And so likewise in Plato's Doctrine of the City, the individuation of the individual happens sort of all at once and then can only ever decay afterwards. And so it's I think that is a useful comparison. Okay, so let's continue. Let me see, where did we end? I think we ended with the seat of reflective intelligence is the head, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, so I'll read from here. This structure is deeply inscribed in the individual being since it corresponds to a topology of the organism. The concupiscent appetites lodged in the stomach can act upon anger, since the stomach is only separated from the thorax by the supple partition of the diaphragm, allowing for movements to pass and impulses to communicate. By contrast, the head is separated from the thorax by this isthmus that the neck is. The independence of the reflective intelligence relative to the passion of anger and the concupiscent appetites is therefore much more easy than the independence of the passion of anger relative to the appetites. This psychology easily translates into ethics according to a schema that should be analyzed. In every Greek civilization, virtue is presented as an excellence. But with Socrates, virtue is directly the excellence of what makes each individual be himself, an excellence of which the individual becomes aware and which fixes and stabilizes him through self-awareness. On the contrary, with Plato, virtue is excellence only indirectly for the individual. Indeed, for the concupiscent appetite, the passion of anger, and the reflective intelligence, there is an excellence proper to each of these three faculties: temperance, courage, and prudence. But unlike with Socrates, the veritable virtue of the individual is not the dominance of the faculty that characterizes it. The order of these faculties is what subordinates the appetites to the passion of anger and the passion of anger to the reflective intelligence. This observation of a rapport is not an excellence, a dynamism, but a structure, or rather the condition for the maintenance of the fundamental structure of the individual being in society and of the city itself. Such is justice for the city and for the individual. It is the supreme virtue, but unlike particular virtues, it is not an excellence, a dynamism. Justice is the stability of a structure due to which reciprocity is established between the interior order of the individual and its exterior activity constituted by social rapports. And excellence can be maintained by itself in the isolation of individual existence. Conversely, the stability of a rapport requires reciprocity between the internal relation and the external relation. The man who is just in himself is just around himself, while the man who is unjust outside himself cannot conserve within himself this justice, which is constituted by the justness, justesse, of rapports and is founded in being. Just as a tool engaged in an incorrect usage, one that does not correspond to its structure, not only distorts the objects to which it is applied, but also distorts itself and can then no longer operate according to its veritable structure. The unjust man in society loses this internal justice that was the justness of his agreement with himself. Whence the idea that fault is not a positive harmfulness that expresses itself, but the result of an error or lack. In this sense, we see how Socrates' teaching is again found in Plato's last works, but it is oddly transformed insofar as it no longer includes this aspect of the aspiration and opening of the individual being, which is what gave Socrates' teaching the force of novelty that terrified the opinion of the old Athenians expressed by Aristophanes. From Socrates to Plato, at least to the Plato of the last dialogues, a displacement occurs that transferred self-awareness from the individual to society. For Socrates, the gnothi seoton is said to the individual. For Plato, it is society that must know itself through the philosopher magistrates. To know itself, it must be fixed and limited, for the recurrent action of self-knowledge cannot be effectuated in the indefinite or the unlimited, and even less so in the undetermined. And the individual is known only through the city's knowledge of itself as the elementary part. Justice, the virtue of structure and not the virtue of excellence, allows for this immediate contact and display without friction between the city and the individual. The city knows the individual by knowing itself. At the level of the laws, the veritable individual is the city. So here we have another contrast between the Socratic position, according to Simondon, and then the Platonic one. So in the Socratic position, we have this notion of virtue as excellence, so meaning that excellence is something that we strive for, and that we have to sort of develop in ourselves. So in the same way that you learn to play the lyre or learn how to ride a horse or whatever, you have to learn how to be excellent in the virtues, in courage and piety and so on. But in Plato's doctrine in the Republic, we have instead not this sort of excellence as something that we strive for, but justice has to do with the insertion into the community and the sort of relationship of functions to each other. And so the justice having to do with the role of the individual, justice has the sort of alternate meaning of justesse. So Simondon is sort of doing a bit of a play on words here, but justesse means something like appropriateness or something along those lines. So there's in the same way that certain tool is appropriate for a certain type of work, and if you try to use a hammer as a screwdriver or vice versa, things are not going to work very well. So there's likewise, if you try to use a person who is sort of naturally destined to be an artisan, if you try to use them as a warrior, things are not going to work well. And so justice is using the individual in an appropriate way. And so what this means is that self-knowledge is not anymore, or not primarily, the knowledge of the individual, but it's the knowledge of the city. So the city, the guardians of the city have to have knowledge of the correct proportions of the different functions and knowledge of which citizens should be assigned to which functions. So this is sort of the transference of self-knowledge from the level of the individual onto the level of the city. Let's see how much more we have of Plato. There's still quite a bit. Okay, so let's continue to the next page here from the top of 453. If someone else would like to read.
Is that does this conception? Is that right?
Yes.
Does this conception of individuality result from the need to conceive a stable city, or on the contrary, does it stem from the critique of knowledge and the conception of being in the Theaetetus, the Sophist, and the Parmenides? It does not fall within the scope of this study to ascertain if Plato was motivated by the will to found the political order, or if his conception of the political order mostly results from the methodological and theoretical discoveries that follow in the dialogues of the critical period. But it should be noted that the conception of the individual being conforms both with the demands of political thought and the discoveries of logical and metaphysical thought. The stable is also the perfect. Quote, above all, the laws need to be stable, unquote. The politician is one who knows how to make the most stable mixture possible. The political problem is a problem of measure. Antithetical constitutions, whether despotism or democracy, are bad when they are isolated. They must be joined together in a stable mixture, a well-proportioned blend produced by the good constitution. The city is quote, a friend to itself, unquote, when there is harmony in it between sensibility and the intelligence, which judges. Taken away from the human individual, love and enthusiasm reappear at the level of the city, such that the law is not sufficient unto itself and is thereby preceded by prologue, which is addressed to the free inclination of the gathering of citizens. Man seems like a, quote, a toy for God, unquote, because the veritable individual is the city, and because the particular being contains within himself neither the whole development of his explanation, nor the ethics that legitimizes and organizes his existence. The consequence of Plato's critique is in fact to displace the points of application of theoretical thought. A philosophy of relation follows after the primordial philosophy of being. In the first two periods of the development of Plato's thought, a Parmenidean conception of being remains behind the Socratic search for essential virtues. This conception, which is clear in the first period, is corrected in the second period by the dynamism of true opinion and the erotic dialectic. The individual is always isolated from the order of actuality, but he is not self-enclosed in the sense that he involves a relation of participation with the ideas and the anhypothetical term that the ascending dialectic supposes. The sensible is nothing but the occasion of this uprising of the soul, which is at the same time a detachment. But in order for the sensible to be the occasion of this uprising, it already must be the image of the archetype. Dynamism is a detachment, no doubt, but the occasion of this discovery of the soul's uprising is a contact with the sensible, which contains in it more than it is, i.e., the image of the world of ideas. The order of actuality only intervenes as image, but nevertheless, there is a certain figuration of being in Genesis, generation, creation, and Thora, destruction. The structure of the sensible is not achieved in itself, since it is not just the occasion of uprising, but the first image of the intelligible.
So here we have a sort of periodization of Plato's thought. So we have, I think, it's not 100% clear here, but I think he's taking the first period to be the Socratic one, the one in which Plato is sort of faithfully depicting Socrates' activities in Athens. And then the second period is the one in which he talks about the sort of dynamism, what Simondon here calls the dynamism of true opinion and the erotic dialectic. So this is especially the symposium, the doctrine in which the individual has to sort of strive for knowledge of the forms or of the ideas, and there's a sort of development of the individual towards knowledge of the ideas. And then after this period, there's a third period in which we have the doctrine of the Republic, in which the souls are sort of assigned to their places in the structure rather than being subject to a development or a dynamism. Okay, let's go on to the next page. Might be able to fit in two more, I think.
Where did we leave off again?
At the top of 454 in the PDF. So that's but the first image of the intelligible.
So 456. Next line is yet this detachment.
Okay. Yet this detachment of the sensible is possible due to the great law of universal paradigmatism that turns the structure of the sensible into the analog of the structure of the world of ideas. It is precisely through this schematism of analogical participation that Parmenides contributes a decisive critique. If several things participate in the same idea, the idea cannot be separated from itself in order to be in each of the things, or to be in them partly, because then the rapport of the total idea to the parts of the idea is inconceivable. We see here that the idea is treated like Parmenidean being, which is singular and homogeneous, consequently indivisible, i.e., complete in each of its parts. Parmenidean being is strictly imparticipable because it has no physis and is not an element, properly speaking. Furthermore, the unity of the idea above the multiplicity of the terms that participate in this idea is impossible, because in order to guarantee the participation of multiple things in a single idea, there must be another idea above the ensemble formed by the multiple things that participate in the idea in which they participate. The difficulty that Plato encounters by wanting to remain faithful to the Parmenidean conception of being consists in the impossibility of conceiving any relation that would not be a being, that would not be endowed with the characteristics of indivisible and static individuality that Parmenidean being represents. Consequently, the relation of participation can only be grasped as a supplementary being added to the system formed by the idea and the realities that participate in the idea. This process of position of new beings for constituting the relation between participant and participated goes to infinity. Moreover, it is not a necessary result of the unicity of the idea and of the multiplicity of things that participate. The difficulty would be the same with a single participating being. What requires this position of an infinity of beings is, in fact, the individualizing static concept of being, which comes from Parmenides. Participation presents such difficulties because Parmenidean being does not include relation within it. Here, the multiplicity of things only intervenes to require the exteriority of the idea. Once the exteriority of the idea is posited, the indefinite reduplication of beings arises only from this exteriority and not from the multiplicity of beings that participate. The argument could apply to the relation between a single thing and the idea in which it participates. The third man argument, which we find in Aristotle, which aims for a separated character of the idea, depends on the same foundation as the one that Plato establishes against his own theory of participation in the Parmenides. The relation of resemblance is powerless to resolve this problem, even if the relation of part to whole is replaced with that of portrait to model. In order for there to be resemblance, there must be participation idea, which leads back to the previous case. Ultimately, knowledge cannot be explained by the relation of participation, for there is an incompatibility between the nature of the idea and its existence within us when it is known. A reality in itself may be known by a science in itself within which we do not partake. Here again, the point of view is the same. The relation that knowledge is incompatible with the idea envisioned as Parmenidean being. The being is deprived of physis and does not have a power of relation or production within it. The being is a static individual, an absolute individual, and consequently imparticipable.
Right. So I mentioned earlier this third man argument that Aristotle makes in the Metaphysics against Plato's doctrine of the ideas, and so the argument is essentially that if you take it that what all men share, what makes all men to be men, is their participation in the idea of man or manhood. Then you can raise the question: what is it that all men share with the idea of man? There has to be something that is common or shared between existing men and the idea of man if they sort of correspond to each other. And then if they share something, then that means they have to participate in some sort of third idea of like meta manhood or something like that, that would unify the idea with the entities that participate in it. And then, of course, you can ask the same question. So, what is it that unifies this meta manhood with the idea of manhood and the individual man and so on? You have this infinite regress of ideas of ideas of ideas. And so Simondon takes it here that Plato himself presents a similar argument in the Parmenides against his own doctrine of the ideas. And he takes it that this is a sort of refutation of the Parmenidean conception of being as this sort of static and self-contained unity. And so we have to have a doctrine of relation which doesn't reduce or identify relation with being, because then if we have a Parmenidean conception which just takes being to be this sort of static and self-contained whole, then each attempt at identifying a relation just ends up producing a new being, which we then have to try to relate again to the original being. And so we have to have a conception of being in which relation has the status of being, is how he puts it in the introduction to Volume 1. And so this the argument of the Parmenides, the dialogue, the Parmenides refutes the Parmenidean conception of being, in which relation is only ever understood as being more being, and so we have to have an understanding of relation as such as having the status of being. Okay, let's read one more page and then we'll shut it down for the day. So yeah, I can read this next page. As a theory of knowledge, the Theaetetus reveals the same difficulty relative to relation. Against Heraclitus and Protagoras, Plato refuses to see in sensation the relation of an agent to a patient that would be valid. Sensation and sensible quality which arise from this relation are nothing without one another and are not stable. No quality is a reality in itself. Consequently, to know is not to feel. But to know also cannot be to judge, for there is no relation between knowledge and ignorance, since there is no mediating reality between being and non-being. This mediating state that true opinion would be does not exist. True judgment is not science. Plato is opposed to the thesis of Antisthenes, who made of science the enumeration of the elements of which reality is composed and the way they are grouped. Nevertheless, Plato does not want a science that would be a knowledge of the rapport between terms that would themselves be unknown. This relation, which would not have its raison d'être in the terms and would not result from the nature of the juxtaposed elements, cannot be thought. The only acceptable relation would be a relation founded in being, but the Parmenides establishes the impossibility of a relation that would not be a being. The second part of the Parmenides opens a new path that is longer than that of participation in being, but that of relation such as hypothetical research discovers it. There is relation of a hypothesis to a consequence, and this relation is that of the attributes that can be given to a subject. We can therefore wonder what are the most general attributes that can be granted or refused to any subject whatsoever. Whole and part, beginning, middle, and end, straight and circular, in something else in something else and in itself, mobile and immobile, same and other, similar and dissimilar, equal and unequal, younger or the same age. These categories are not categories prepared in advance for research. These categories are veritable relations, for they increasingly arise from demonstration, like a mathematical figure whose properties are discovered based on a consequence that is also a reconstruction. Relation becomes without participation of being. It is interior to being. This indicates that being is no longer Parmenidean being, an absolute individual that consists in its individuality. Whether we hypothesize that the one is or the one is not, we are led to affirm and then deny, about the one as well as things other than the one, all the couples of contraries. Knowledge will merely have to limit this indefinite fruitfulness of the relation between ideas. The inconceivable relation between ideas and things is replaced with the relation between idea and idea. Participation will be replaced with the communication of ideas. The sophist shows that a thing cannot be defined in itself. It can only be defined by relation. That which wholly is opposed to the multiplicity of Phaedo's isolated and fixed ideas. That which wholly is has intelligence, life, and soul, but is at rest and completely changeless even though it's alive. Being contains both the force to act and to be acted upon. Being limited by itself is too poor. Being includes not just the idea or object that is known, but the subject that knows it, the intelligence and soul within which relation is incorporated. Relation, such as it appears in the Sophist as a sort of table of categories, should not be considered as a simple aspect of the mind. It is real, and we see these categories in some way become various elements in the Timaeus. And so then here he's comparing the development in the Parmenides that we just discussed with the development in the Theaetetus, having to do with knowledge. And so in that dialogue, the true knowledge or knowledge in itself is opposed to right opinion. So having the correct opinion about something is not knowledge in the true sense of the term. And in order to have true knowledge, you have to have a sort of grasp of something in a way that is not required for correct opinion. And so there's this necessity of teachability. So you have to be able to teach someone else your knowledge in order to truly know something, as opposed to having the correct opinion about something which you might not necessarily be able to teach. And then Simondon here passes to what he calls the second part of the Parmenides, where he takes it that it's not just a question of refuting the doctrine of participation like in the earlier part, but of depicting a new relationship of ideas to each other. So these ideas form categories. So these are sort of primordial ideas, or ideas that structure the whole realm of ideas. And we see this in the Sophist. He gives a list of 5 categories, which I don't remember exactly what they are. But he one of the sort of key doctrines of the Sophist is that there's a sort of intermingling of being and non-being, so that you have to say of entities that are also that they are not in some sense. And so this is in opposition to the earlier doctrine of the ideas as presented in the Parmenides, in the beginning of the Parmenides, and this notion of participation, in which there's no sort of middle term between being and non-being. Okay, so we're pretty much at time. So let's stop here for today, and we'll pick up from the middle of 456 in the PDF. It's probably 458 or so, I guess, in the printed book.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, thanks for joining today, and see you all next week.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.